Hello friends, it's Chops and welcome to another Chops vlog. Before we get too far into this one, I wanted to mention that I do occasionally go back and watch my old videos just to kind of get a handle on how my channel is presenting itself to viewers. And my last two videos were awfully whiny. I'm sorry about that. I don't want to be the guy that gets on YouTube and just makes a bunch of videos about how much he hates the game he spends so much time playing. I think that's very stupid. I don't hate the game. It's awesome. I love the game. I had some frustrations with it and they kind of boiled over, and they boiled over for an extended period of time, and that resulted in a couple of videos that were really kind of down. Sorry about that. Not going to do that in the future. Today's video is about how awesome this game is. Before we get to that, I do want to give a general update. My 80 Hunter, we are talking Wrath Classic here if you couldn't tell. My 80 Hunter, I think I got 80 before the last video. But anyways, I finished questing through Storm Peaks, finished questing through Ice Crown, got enough emblems of heroism to buy my 39 Twink, the BOA axe and the BOA shoulders. I am working on getting enough emblems of heroism to buy the chest, but I ran out of quests that gave them, so I had to take a little detour, had to get a little bit more geared, and so that I could step into heroics. We did that for the first time today, and so in the next couple of days I will have a BOA chest for my Twink, and then my Twink will be this. It'll be awesome. It'll be good. I've played a bunch of games recently in the bracket on my 39, and I am constantly reminded just how much I missed this iteration of Warrior Twinking. It's just awesome. It's a lot of fun. I'm glad I'm back in it, which brings me segues nicely into sort of what I wanted to mostly talk about today, was riffing off of a post someone made on the forums a couple of weeks ago, and it just kind of stuck in the back of my head. And they had asked, why would you bother twinking in Wrath of the Lich King when you know it's going to end, when you could just twink in retail and that way, it doesn't have an endpoint. It's just going to keep going. And let's ignore for a second that that kind of every expansion in retail is its own sort of version of twinking, and all of those versions do come to an end. Like Mop twinking was very different from WAD twinking, which was very different from Legion, which was very different from BFA, which was very different from Shadowlands. And all of those eras of twinking did start and end. We're going to ignore that. We're going to go ahead and just accept the framing that retail is sort of a continuous, unending, and unbroken block of twinking that has no end point, where Wrath of the Lich King twinking is a discrete, probably 1 to 1.5 year experience of twinking before they decide to roll out Cata Classic and what I'm sure will be another disgusting cash grab. The reason for that is that I find ephemeral things to be more enjoyable than permanent things. To give you an example that I think everybody can kind of generally relate to, it's the same appeal of revisiting a TV show that's ended, right? In a pop culture reference, I'm sure very few of you will get. I remember reading a book called House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski, where in a little vignette story, the main character goes off to a party where he's listening to somebody tell a story, and that somebody opens by telling how the story ends. And he explains that he does that so that when you're listening to the story, you'll be less concerned about what the plot is, which is a very superficial way of engaging with the story. Since that you know how it ends, you can instead concentrate on the craft of how the story is told. That is kind of what makes Wrath of the Lich King so attractive, right? Is that we know how it ends. So we don't have to worry about, what's the next raid tier going to be? What's the next patch going to bring? we know what it's gonna bring. But to take that one step higher, I think it also speaks to a way in which people seek enjoyment and seek happiness. And that is that, especially here in America, we generally have this sort of culturally informed view of happiness being something that you work toward. You will eventually achieve happiness if you work harder, you get a nice house, you have the right spouse, the right car, the right family, the right dog. Not a dog like mine that's snoring very loudly in the background. But those things, as you acquire them and as you work harder and you have enough, money in the bank, money saved up for retirement, a loving family, kids, eventually you will find happiness. And that will be a state that you achieve and then never leave, right? Where I think we're starting to realize that happiness is much more a sort of fleeting state of being that comes and goes, often in very mundane experiences and in the routine of day-to-day life, and that especially if you have a brain as broken as mine, you have no real control over forcing yourself to find happiness or being able to retain that happiness when you do find it. It's just a very fleeting thing that comes and goes in bits and pieces. And sure, maybe you're not like desperately sad all the time and then happiness kind of creeps around every now and again. Maybe you're just kind of contentedly going through life and you find happiness here and there, right? And that's much more realistic, and I think a much healthier way to engage with the concept of happiness and the concept of enjoyment is to try to find it in those sort of everyday routine and the mundane experiences of existence is to find that happiness there. Know that it's not something you're ever going to actually find. They've actually done studies on this. There isn't an amount of material good or family structure or anything that guarantees a level of happiness. It's just that you learn to find them when you sort of feel secure enough in the world to let your guard down a little bit, right? And then that happiness is never permanent. It doesn't stick around once you've found it. And I think that interfaces interestingly with MMOs. A good MMO will thread the needle between releasing content fast enough to keep their player base engaged and entertained, but also slow enough that the bulk of their players will get most of the gear or most of the collections or most of the achievement points or whatever it is that your MMO has its progression system built around. And then just as most of your players have gotten around 70 to 80% of that, you release the next tier of content and they have to start all over again. And that's kind of the dance that MMO developers have to dance, is the pace that they release their content at. With the whole explicit design policy of an MMO is to keep people chasing that endpoint, because gamers have that sort of vision of like, well, once I get my gear set finished, that's when I'll really be blowing the pants off the damage meter, or that's where I'll really be pushing arena rating, is once I get those last few pieces of gear, man. Just need to get those last few pieces of gear. Just got to get that last trinket or whatever. That's when the game really starts. That's when I'll find happiness. That's when I'll be able to enjoy it. And so I think a lot of frustration with gaming, and especially modern WoW, is that the pacing of the content and the players' expectations of how much they'll get out of that content have kind of gotten out of sync with each other, right? It's either too fast or it's too slow. Either Blizzard just hasn't found that sweet spot. Either everybody's got all the gear they're going to need and there's no new content to do, or Blizzard's releasing content too quickly and everybody feels like they're just constantly unfinished, right? And so I think that players in general of video games should recognize that. That's a very subconscious thing. It's not something you consciously think to yourself, right? You don't think to yourself, yes, I am going to define happiness as something that I am going to chase. Because none of us think like that. We just kind of subconsciously think to ourselves that, yes, I will finally be happy when XYZ thing happens. And that's kind of how we approach MMOs. I'll finally find that enjoyment, that last piece of gear. And I think gamers need to adjust away from that towards that sort of finding happiness and enjoyment in the mundane and in the routine, because there are good stories that happen in the day-to-day of playing an MMO, which I think brings us to twinking, right? So when we talk about twinking, the progression necessarily flips. And I've talked about this a couple of videos ago, where in end game, the progression is usually defined by a sort of gear treadmill. I get 70 to 80% of the gear that I need. The next tier gets released. I work my way back up. 70 to 80% of the gear I need. The next tier gets released and I work my way back up. In twinking, getting geared is phase one, right? And then progression is generally either you branch off into doing a little bit of PvE twinking and you're chasing achievements and completionist stuff, or you're PvP twinking and your progression is your honor kill count, your win-loss ratio, if there's any scheduled tournaments or anything that you enter and you win, or your guild plays pre-maze against other guilds, like that's your sense of progression in twinking, or you blend the two of them kind of like I do. That approach, and again, I've touched on it in other videos, that approach is what leads you to sort of find enjoyment and find happiness in the mundane routine. And then to bring that even further, I think that when you introduce the assumed sunsetting date of Wrath of the Lich King, now I can go through, not only do I have a twink that is in the next day or two going to be Biss, and then I'll have 12 to 18 months of not needing to progress my gear at all. I'll find the enjoyment in the oddball Warsong Gulch games. I'll find it in chasing the occasional completionist thing. I'll find it in just fishing off in Loch Modan or whatever. Like, it'll be there. But with the added appreciation of knowing that it has a sunset date, which removes much of the anxiety of me having to worry about, well, what's the next expansion going to bring? What's the next content patch? Is it going to change anything for what I need? Is it going to mess up my enchants? Is it going to force me to farm up a new piece of gear because they retooled the dungeon? Like, none of those questions exist in classic twinking because we know the answers. So that anxiety is completely removed from classic twinking. And I think it took me stepping away from retail twinking to find just how pervasive that anxiety is in retail twinks. Like, it's like stepping back and looking at a funhouse mirror now. I think that because that specific anxiety is removed from classic twinking, it makes it way more enjoyable, even though I know that at some point it's going to end, right? And I also think that knowing something has an end is often a part of what makes things more enjoyable. And it is to go back to the old TV shows, knowing that how that TV show ends, how that one season TV show, that 6-season TV show, you know the beats, you know the stories, you know the character development. But so many people go back to those because knowing that stuff does let you appreciate, one, how that story was built, constructed, and relayed to you, the viewer. But two, it does remove the anxiety of, ooh, what's going to happen? You can really kind of step back and get a grander picture of it. And I think that is a large part of the appeal of Wrath Twinking. And so I can step back and really, we didn't know it when we were playing it, but it was the good old days. And now we have a chance to go back and play it knowing what we know now, and we can really appreciate it for what it was and what it is. And I think that it having an end date ramps up that appreciation. I really, really enjoy it, and I am soaking in every bit of it as much as I can. And I think that is really increasing my appreciation of the game, because it will go away. I don't particularly trust Blizzard to not move on to Cataclysm Classic. It would rule if they were just like, yeah, we're not going to. But of course they're going to. So of course this is all going to come to an end. And I think that makes me like it even more, not less. Not because there's some weird sunk cost fallacy in it where I have spent all this time in something that I know is eventually going to get taken away from me. That's the wrong way to think about it. It's enjoying the experience that you're having while you're putting in that time. Because again, I'm not working towards happiness. This is where I will find it. And that's the long, rambly answer of why Wrath Twinking when you know it's going to end, and it's because I know it's going to end. Anyway, that's all I had for you guys today. As always, thank you for sticking it out to the end of the video that you knew was coming. It really does mean a lot to me, and I will talk to you guys next time.